What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Nutrition Improvement Podcast. We want to, I guess, by the time of this recording, to apologize because if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, we've experienced some outages, I guess, because of the fact that I don't know what happened. We're trying to kind of figure that out. But if you listen to us in Apple Podcasts, we highly suggest, if you haven't really been seeing our latest episodes, go to Spotify, and you can also kind of access those on there as well. Or if you actually are on an Android, on Google Play too. But anyways, we have a really cool topic of conversation here for you guys here today. So we're gonna go and dive right into it. But before, obviously, introducing our podcast sidekick, Kenzie, what's going on? How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good, good. I think by the time of this recording, you're gonna be closer to starting your school, or actually, I think you're going to be in vacation. So what is it again that you're
Yeah.
going?
Yeah, I'm going to Banff, which is in Alberta, in Canada.
Okay,
And yeah, 5 days until I leave. Very excited
nice.
about that. So when this
Are you
releases, I
actually
will be
camping,
there.
or you're staying in like a hotel and everything?
Staying in a hostel,
Okay,
and doing some hiking there and
nice.
like
Is
seeing
it
the
family trip
sights.
or just like going solo with friends?
Just one of my friends from high school, we're gonna go together. So that'll be fun. I haven't done that
Awesome.
in quite a while, going on a
Yeah,
trip
this
with
is
a
gonna be a
friend.
fun trip. That's exciting. Cool. I'm sure you get a lot of steps in.
Yeah, tons of steps. And I was talking to my friend the other day and saying, okay, we'll stop at the grocery store when we get there, get some protein bars, get a little bit of some, maybe a protein drink or something like that.
Yeah, it's funny because I had a client. Actually, we talked about her, Amanda. She went on like a trek down in, I think, Colorado, somewhere around there, and it was like a 35-mile hike, which is insane. They
Yeah.
did that on one day. So like, I mean, if you think about like 1 mile and then you think about walking, I got a pace of 50 minutes. You can imagine. I mean, that was like literally like a 12 hour, or like 12 hours just walking. So, which is interesting because obviously the amount of damage you create around muscle, which actually we're going to talk about this a little bit today, it's incredibly high. So as you go
Yeah.
there, it's actually like something you need to pay attention to, because you're going to be a lot more active than you've ever been, because again, you work mostly like sitting down and that kind of thing. So like it's going to be like a full day of activity. I typically, when we go on vacation, like we usually tend to like burn more calories in general, simply because of the fact that we're just so much more active than we're home, even when we're not really exercising or doing like an actual workout. So that's probably you'll notice that. So
Yeah, and you often don't realize because you're just taking in the sights, you're walking around, you're chatting if you're with someone. So um, remembering to fuel up will be really important for sure.
yeah, and recover, which this
Yeah.
is the whole kind of like point of today's podcast, which is gonna be just a little bit more of like a protein 101, and really we're gonna dive into a study that you were gonna dissect a little bit into, kind of uncovering a pretty important question that now it's being asked a lot, which is, if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, or you actually consume plant-based proteins, do you actually have the same ability to maintain and build muscle mass? And we're going to answer that question based on this study, which has a lot of limitations, but we'll kind of get into that. But before we get into it, though, I think it would be kind of helpful to do a quick little background on protein, shall we?
Yeah, for sure.
So where would we start with that? Maybe definitions or
I would start at the very beginning with the amino acids, the building blocks of how we get there. So maybe we can chat a bit about that and about complete versus incomplete proteins. I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, perfect. I do remember this was actually one of my first classes ever in college, and it was a biochemistry class. And the first thing that they talked about, and I still remember like it was yesterday in the auditorium that I was like taking this class, which they talk about, high biological value and low biological value. And then they were talking specifically about proteins. And ever since then, protein has been one of my most favorite macronutrients to kind of talk about and discuss. And actually one of the most essential, honestly, out of all of them. All of them are actually important, but we can technically survive without carbohydrates, at least like from out for exogenous sources, but we can't survive without protein. So that's really the main reason why I like to kind of discuss it a lot. So we'll start obviously with main definition. So proteins, just like any other macronutrient, it's a molecule, and it's a molecule that is composed of different kinds of components. But essentially, if you think about a protein, it's like this big, large chain, and sometimes that change can be like all knotted, like a bunch of different kinds of knots around it. So that's going to be very a complex kind of like very structural kind of protein, or it can be just like a simple chain. But those chains that make up those like knots and everything into that protein, kind of like, or like full structure, they're actually going to, each one of those links that put it together is what we call amino acids. And the human body processes and can absorb and use up 20 as amino acids, out of which 9 are essential. Just for people listening in to understand essential versus non-essential, essential nutrients are going to be nutrients that your body requires from food that cannot process from its own kind of like, from your own body. And there's other kinds of non-essential nutrients that your body can produce, through different kinds of like, sources in your own body. It can actually make it up because your body requires it. So there's in nature 9 essential amino acids, out of which like one is conditional, which means that there's different times in life in which like you may need to supplement or get it from diet, and other times you may not have to. And then there's going to be another 11 non-essential amino acids that your body doesn't necessarily require from food. So all that essentially comprises like 20 amino acids in nature that the human body requires. Now, proteins are made up of those amino acids. Now, the thing about what describes a high biological value and low biological value protein, or essentially we just kind of call it like, high quality and low quality, it's that amino acid composition. When you have in a specific amount in a specific portion of protein, think chicken or something like that, and you have in a specific amount all essential amino acids, that is technically considered a high quality protein. When you now take the same, counterpart of another same amount of portion of a different kinds of protein source, in this case, a lot of times can be plant-based or sometimes even animal-based that maybe don't have a full entire spectrum of amino acids, although most animal-based proteins typically will have a full entire spectrum of all essential amino acids. But in the case of plant-based proteins, a lot of times they may be missing important essential amino acids that it doesn't have. So that makes it a little bit more a low quality. It's not about good or bad. It's not like this is good and this is bad. It's just simply more about the composition of what those amino acids have. There are some of them there's typically kind of like lacking. There's the other ones too that just simply don't have everything, and the ones that typically have everything. So that's how we kind of like explain what we call complete versus incomplete protein, or high quality versus like low quality. It's sort of like synonymous. So like to explain the kind of like the same thing. Complete protein has all amino acids, and incomplete proteins typically don't have like all of them. That doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot get all your essential amino acids if you just kind of get different sources of protein into your diet, pretty much. So I think that pretty much kind of covers that.
Yeah, and in terms of how it relates to our topic today of vegan versus omnivorous diets, for vegans, you can have certain food combinations that when you put them together, they give you all the amino acids that you need. So you can meet your amino acid needs. You just need to do a bit more mixing and matching. So
Yeah.
grains and nuts and seeds, they're low in certain amino acids in lysine, but they're good sources of other ones like tryptophan, methionine, and cysteine. And then on the other hand, legumes aren't a good source of tryptophan and methionine and cysteine, but they're high in lysine. So when you put those together, it's like this puzzle
You
and they
get the
fit
full
together and you
thing.
get the full thing.
Yeah. So and that's kind of like the main thing that exists. But the main thing behind that is like really understanding too. Not talking a bit more about protein, understanding exactly why is it important, because why are those amino acids important is because they're literally involved in so many different things. Now you probably have heard of protein as like the one thing that you'll need for gaining muscle, but in reality, there are so many different kinds of reactions that if I actually describe them to you right now, because I actually kind of have it written down in here, you would be like, okay, that was like too much for me. But they're involved in so many different things, from your DNA production to essentially translation of this creation of different proteins, like muscle protein, of course, like being able to kind of like build muscle mass, recovery, your body's ability to be able to actually like oxidize fat. Actually, proteins are involved into that. Appetite and body composition, appetite regulation, even for moms that are about to like, give birth, is about involved into like lactation. It's involved in obviously your reproductive system, hormones, mediation of hormones, antioxidant defenses, like so many different things in protein is involved. And sometimes that we don't necessarily consider how much of an impact it actually makes in us. And getting little or no protein at all is definitely a big issue. And most people will think, oh, it's fine, I'm not trying to gain muscle. But then they don't understand and realize that it's so much more than that. That's just only one little piece of the puzzle that is required in your body to be able to accomplish so much many or other different things around, like, why protein is important. And getting the combination of those all essential amino acids is going to make sure that the role that protein has in our bodies is effective and optimal. And I think that's like kind of like the bigger part when we typically run into issues. So essentially, just to kind of like um, summarize this, like our proteins are required for cellular metabolism. So make sure that, in cells, like everything's like, working correctly, sending messages within between cells, because a lot of most hormones are typically proteins, and creating structure such as tissues, including muscle, but also bone, and like, other kinds of tissues for like, all the kind of parts of your body. So, and your bodies are always, this is the thing about that too, like, your bodies are always building up proteins and also breaking down proteins, and it's like a turnover effect, and they call it a protein turnover. So essentially, like, when you break muscle down, like, or you actually exercise, you're actually breaking down proteins because there's damage around muscle. That's normal, and you need to make sure that you're also kind of have enough protein to be able to rebuild that back up. So, and there's like this concept not known, and we're going to get a little nerdy in here, but it's called nitrogen balance, which kind of explains, because one of the components of protein in like the actual, like the chemistry of a protein, is a nitrogen component. So usually a way that they describe and understand whether you actually have enough protein in your body to actually meet its needs is through this concept known as nitrogen balance. When you're in a positive nitrogen balance state, that means obviously you have more production of nitrogen, which means there's more protein that your body requires in that moment. So that's good. When you have a neutral or balance like nitrogen, like, or you literally nitrogen balance, I guess, that means obviously you have enough protein to actually meet up like the amount of breakdown that exists. And when you have a negative protein nitrogen balance, that means that there's less protein coming in than the amount that is being broken down. And that usually is going to be a problem, because that's going to lead for obviously to like your body requiring its own sources to be able to break down protein. So this is when we kind of have issues such as, muscle wasting and not necessarily kind of getting enough protein, and your body starts to use its own sources to try to make up for the lack that it's not necessarily getting. So that's in terms of obviously understanding like the big kind of difference that exists and why is it so important in terms of getting enough on a daily basis, pretty much.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good overview of all the important things that protein's doing within the body on a cellular level. If you're looking at fat loss now, and muscle gain as well, do you want to talk a little bit about why it's important to include sources of protein in your diet?
Yeah, and the biggest thing is like when it comes down to like, most people think of protein, as I mentioned, like that sometimes they're not really well versed and understand too much concepts around nutrition, and they think protein equals muscle. And as I said, there's so many different things involved into it, but then protein is like equally important for fat loss. When you're trying to reduce body fat, you still need a good amount of protein for many different and various reasons. One, because protein is actually has a satiety effect. So it actually makes you feel fuller longer when you consume it. Two, protein is definitely going to help you recover better from your workouts, because it helps you actually build and recover or rebuild like some of those muscle fibers that you broke down. And when you do that, then you can get back into training a lot quicker. So you have recover better, and then that makes it better as well. So imagine like you going in this like massive hike that you're gonna go into, and then if you're not recovered properly, then you're gonna go into the next day and you're maybe kind of tired, exhausted. You're not maybe able to actually do a full length hike that you actually were planning on, because of the fact that you simply did not recover properly. The other part too is like, okay, muscle building itself, which, for most people say, like, I don't want to gain muscle. But, and usually women typically talk through that or talk about this. And the reality is that it's not necessarily the whole idea of like, getting bulky or anything like that. It's the fact that muscle is such an integral part of our body, that having really good amount of them and obviously according to your body type and all, is definitely going to actually help you have a pretty good metabolism. Because if you think about muscle, it's like a very, very metabolically active tissue. And all that means is that it requires a lot of energy to be able to maintain it. So think about it as like a very high maintenance type of like, tissue in your body. It requires so much calories just to maintain and support it. And the reason for that is because there's so much blood that needs to go into muscle to make sure that it operates appropriately. Like there's going to be so much oxygen that goes into your muscle fibers so they can fire up and they can do all the things that you're supposed to do. Versus, for example, a tissue that is like very metabolically like inactive, which is going to be fat. Fat doesn't require that much maintenance. It just sits there because it's a storage type of like place. right? A storage unit doesn't, like, if you think about, for example, a storage unit, like one of those places they kind of store all kinds of different things like that. There's nobody works there, nobody does anything. They just simply need to kind of keep the lights on, electricity going, because all that does is hold things inside of it. And that's exactly what fat does. So when we are talking about building muscle, we are talking about the ability of you to actually like have a lot more energy coming out of your body to try to make sure that you maintain that. So what does that, and how does that kind of actually help you with fat loss? Well, because you're just burning more calories on a daily basis. And when you're doing that, obviously fat needs to be broken down to provide some of the energy for maintenance of that muscle, especially when you're doing it the right way, and maintaining a calorie deficit and yada, yada. So that's usually why it's so important in this kind of situations. So every time somebody comes to me and says like, I want to lose body fat, I equally, like, I always say like, okay, cool, but then gaining muscle mass and maintaining muscle mass, it's equally important for that. And they usually would say like, no, but I don't want that. It's like, I get that you don't want that. And we're not talking about you kind of becoming like the next Mr. Olympia, or like trying to kind of like get into like, this like bulky person that you don't want to become. It's more about muscle integrity, making sure that you have the right amount of muscle in your body so you can actually have a pretty good and optimal metabolism.
Yeah, and for women as well, because like just in terms of hormones, like it's very hard for women to put on the amount of muscle that would be necessary in order to like to look very bulky. Like definitely there are some body types and some nutrition strategies that will get women in that, like will allow them to look that way. But for most people, it's going to be just it's going to give your body some shape, and it's going to also allow you to perform your daily activities more easily and just help you feel good. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
not just like either no resistance training or physique competitor. There's a whole spectrum in
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. I think that's like definitely like it's just basically understanding that there's like so much many different kinds of situations around that. And regardless, protein still becomes integral into all that.
Mhm.
So and that's a big thing to that. So and honestly that we're recording this podcast here today is because one of the biggest kind of hurdles that maybe people kind of experience on a daily basis is like obviously their dietary lifestyle, and how do they typically eat. And nowadays, we're seeing a lot more plant-forward, plant-based individuals, and that typically like to adopt for more of like a plant-like based lifestyle, including obviously people that are vegan for various reasons, whether it's health, ethical reasons, religious reasons, like whatever those cases may be. And we are diet agnostic, so we definitely don't necessarily think that anything is more superior than anything else. It's more about understanding what would make it more optimal for you to still be able to achieve some of those goals, and not necessarily feel like you need to actually change your preferences because of the fact that you can't accomplish something. And that's something in this case that we're talking about is muscle gains, which is, you probably have heard, so many people talk about the idea is like, oh, vegans can get enough protein so they can't probably gain muscle mass. And this has been applied to many different kinds of situations. So recently on Examine, they published this article, or not they just simply did an evaluation on this article that was actually published. I don't remember where. I think it's called, I just kind of like put in here the name. So this article is called, um, is actually published in Sportsmed in clinical trials, and it's called High Protein Plant-Based Diet versus a Protein Match Omnivorous Diet, which omnivorous is just people that eat both like, plants and meat, to support resistance training adaptations, a comparison between habitual vegans and omnivores. So essentially what they looked into, and maybe you can kind of explain a little bit more about what they looked into, and we can kind of break it down a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So the question they were asking is when vegans and omnivores consume the same amount of protein, are vegan diets less effective for muscle building when you're doing a resistance training program? So they took two groups, 19 men in each group. They were physically active men, but hadn't been following any kind of resistance training program for a year.
Mhm.
And one group was a vegan group. They'd been vegan for at least a year. And the other group was a omnivore group. They'd been following that diet for at least a year as well.
Mhm.
And then they put them through a 12-week resistance training program, which was just it was 2 sessions a week of some lower body exercises, and measured their muscle building and their strength to see whether there was any difference there.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess the other important point to include is the amount of protein. So they were making sure that these people were having 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight in protein.
Okay, gotcha. And just to kind of break it down even further, so they basically what they look at when it comes down to understanding how much muscle, like a lot of these like studies when they're looking under body composition, people need to be obviously, and I participated in the studies before, and they're brutal, depending on who's running in. But I actually participated in one that actually had to do muscle biopsies, and the needle was the size of my finger, and it was just like so painful. Um, but essentially, what these like studies look at, and what they essentially do, depending on how much control. Here's the thing about when we're evaluating a lot of the studies, and this like one of the few times that we talked about an actual study in question, is understanding like how many variables, how many things within the study were controlled when they were doing this. So essentially what they did is like, again, they took 19 and 19 people, like vegans and omnivores. So they had to really evaluate, are they truly vegan? Are they truly omnivores? And then essentially they realized, okay, how much protein is this people having through those 24-hour recalls, which is all the 24-hour recall is they're asking like, hey, what did you eat? What did you eat yesterday? What did you eat for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner, snacks? What did you drink? All those different things like that. So it's all based on like your memory, like of what you had, right? So that's kind of like the main idea behind this. So they look at this like individuals and they ask him that. It's like, and they evaluate it based on and everything that they said. Like, yeah, I think I had a cup of rice, or I had like a cup of beans type of thing, which is not always accurate. And they simply kind of said that, and then they evaluated how much protein that actually matched to be in vegans versus omnivores. And I think what they essentially did is they gave them a supplement, right? Which, it's going to be like either a soy-based supplement, which is plant-based, or it's going to be a whey protein supplement to match up to make sure that they were getting 1.6 grams per kilogram. And just for reference, 1 point's like, like the RDA standards, which is like the recommended dietary allowances in the United States, they say that people need to have anywhere between 0.8 to 0.9 grams of protein per day. I did a podcast on this, which it was actually kind of talking about on Jillian Michaels' response on how much protein you need, which was kind of like crazy. And I essentially explained this a little bit more further. So you can go back to that episode. Don't remember exactly what number it was, but I think it was like probably like at least like 20 episodes back when we kind of covered some of these different things in that. But essentially kind of going back to the study, what they did is they're making sure that they were getting at least 1.6 grams per kilogram, which actually averaged out to be about 130 grams per day.
For a 180-pound male.
Yeah,
so,
for an 100-pound male. Yeah, I think that's what he kind of mentioned. The program was actually 2 workouts per week. And these were untrained people. So let's just make sure that we kind of make a big kind of aspect in here, because it's important for you to understand, like when sometimes you read certain kind of tabloid or like news channels, like, oh, do this and you're going to gain this much. And usually a lot of those like articles and media, they come out from some of these studies, and it's how people interpret the studies. There's a difference between an untrained male and a trained male. And the same thing for females: untrained female, a trained female. An untrained male, when you put them to do, an untrained means like they basically don't have any training experience. They don't train regularly. They don't lift weights regularly. Maybe they have done it a few times. Maybe they do it once, like every 3 weeks, but it's not consistent. And that kind of person usually is going to be somebody that when they start working out, and they incorporate that a 12-week resistance training program very consistently, it's so much more easier for them to build muscle mass than a person that is trained, regardless of the whatever like variables they're kind of injecting in here, such as like adding more protein, plant-based versus like versus a vegan, or like plant-based versus obviously like an animal-based diet. So in this case, that was definitely a limitation. Not a limitation, it's just the fact that you have to be aware that these were untrained males in the process. So yeah, so that's essentially kind of like the background behind that. So what happened? What were the findings?
Yeah, so what they found was that there was no difference in the muscle building and strength gains between these two groups, or no significant difference statistically. And it was interesting. It's an interesting finding because some previous research found that if you put some people through resistance training and then give them either a plant-based supplement like a soy protein or whey protein, there's more muscle protein synthesis, so more muscle building in the whey group, so in the animal-based protein group, and that was like right after exercise, so they call that acute. So, but they found in this longer-term study where it's a 12-week resistance program, there was no significant difference between the two.
Yeah, and that was actually pretty interesting to kind of see, because of the fact that, okay, like we need to look at different kinds of like drawbacks and different things in here that could have explained that. First off, I'm excited for that because it obviously says, like, for people that are vegan, okay, you're not cursed because of the fact that you're just vegan. You just need to make sure that you kind of get enough protein. And the bigger things that happens in this study that it may not happen in real life is the fact that these people were giving 2 protein shakes per day. And it was a soy-based protein and probably had like 20 to 25 grams of protein. So honestly, most of the protein, like literally, I would say the 40% of the protein needs daily were coming from a protein shake. For somebody that doesn't like that or doesn't usually incorporate supplemental protein, and that is like either a vegan or vegetarian or whatever may be the case, they may not be kind of getting some of the same results. So keep in mind that that's one thing that was kind of like important to mention in this specific study, because they were consistently given a soy-based type of protein, which actually soy happens to be like containing a lot of more of those kind of like essential amino acids, not a full complete one, but always very kind of closely to an animal, a plant-based like or an animal-based protein as well. So that's something else also it's important to kind of like consider here too. Other kinds of really good combination of plant-based proteins is like pea and rice proteins. Those combinations are typically going to be pretty good. But that's definitely going to be a big kind of like part of it too. The other part, it's like it was a very small study, only like 19 people on each leg. It's definitely very small. Then the other part too, it's like it was on men. We don't know anything about women, and that's another part too that obviously was not studied. And the other part too is that they only did like, I mentioned here that the resistance training program only consisted in 2 leg exercises, leg extension and leg press. Like I would have loved to see, for example, like a full blown, like, 4 days a week resistance training program. I think it would have been similar results, but it would have been a better kind of like an idea and into really whether there was a significant kind of change or not. And the last part is definitely going to be the fact that a 24-hour recall is not always going to be the most accurate way to understand people's diets. So for all it means, like this like 19 guys that were like vegan were maybe not necessarily fully vegan. Maybe they were having some like plant-based because they maybe had no education around it. So it's really kind of hard to control for that. So the best way to do a study like this is like you prepare the foods for them, like you give them the foods for 12 weeks, like like here's exactly what you're gonna eat as a vegan. Then obviously with your supplementation, here's what you're gonna eat as an omnivore person or a person that is like does include animal products. And then let's see obviously what the findings are. But that's so hard to control and so more expensive. And that's why obviously some of the studies don't really look at some of that kind of stuff like that. So that's kind of like my take on it. But the bigger kind of like, takeaways on this entire study is the fact that when you get enough protein on a daily basis, regardless it comes from plant-based sources or not, you don't have to compromise your ability to be able to gain muscle mass, at least especially in the beginning stages when you're starting resistance training. That is a kind of like the bigger thing. But obviously there are going to be drawbacks or kind of like issues with like plant-based diets when it comes down to getting enough protein, because a lot of times it's a lot of volume of food. I don't know if you've actually seen, I think we were talking about this, like what we were, yeah, I think we talked about this like the other day, like in one of our content meetings, which it was like, I think we should kind of come up with like a plant-based, like how to get 200 grams of protein from plant-based. And you're like, whoa, that's going to be a lot of food, because that's a reality, right? Like it's so much food to be able to kind of get that, because you start to think about all the sources. I mean, we're talking about like things like, like beans and peas and like some grains and options like this. So they're still going to provide a ton of carbohydrates, some fats and different things like that. So I think that's usually the challenge. So food alone, getting enough protein on a vegan diet without any kind of supplemental protein for purposes of gaining muscle mass may be difficult.
Yeah, I think a big takeaway here, there are definitely limitations to the study, but needing to have that protein supplementation, if your goal really is to build muscle on a vegan diet, it's likely that you will need a supplement to do it, because it's just hard to because when you're having these vegan protein sources like the lentils and beans and all of those, it's coming along with a lot of carbs, and that's adding more calories to your day. So yes, you're getting more protein, but you're also getting a ton more calories. So you might be, depending on what your energy balance is like and how active you are, you're also probably like you could be gaining weight as well.
Yeah, I think that's like a big thing. And at the same time, when you think about maintaining muscle, when you say, for example, you're just trying to kind of like lose body fat, that also kind of comes at a cost, because like how do you kind of keep your calories low while trying to kind of keep your protein high, right? That's another kind of like big kind of piece of the equation here that a lot of times we kind of struggle to see, but it's also like a pretty important kind of like reality check around this in different kinds of areas. But all in all, when protein and dietary intake of protein is adequate, you should be able to build muscle mass, especially when the stimulus of training is adequate as well. I just think a lot of times that people might look at this study and says like, oh, no worries, I'm a vegan. I read the study that says like I can kind of gain muscle, but then you're not understanding exactly what it would require for you to be able to do that. So that's, I think that's the main thing. So I would say like supplementation, though not 100% necessary, it would probably be like very suggested in order for you to be able to kind of do that based on this study specifically that we're kind of like looking on here too, as well as that. So also notable, you mentioned in here in some of the notes that we wrote, vegan participants have significantly lower and deficient vitamin D levels. And then, yeah, so I think the bigger thing also for vegans is making sure that they're paying attention to micronutrient deficiencies, because that's something that kind of happens often. So for example, one thing I would recommend to vegans that they don't get from like that they're not getting from animal-based sources is actually creatine supplementation. And the reason is because creatine is kind of helpful for not only body composition and muscle gains, but also performance, cognitive and abilities, all different things like that. And because the fact that they don't really kind of get any animal-based proteins, which is where most creatine typically is like located, then they would typically kind of like struggle to kind of get enough in terms of that. So that's one supplement that I would recommend to all vegans to
Yeah,
consider.
and vegans supplementing with creatine typically see more significant results because they don't have the same creatine that meat eaters do. The other one is B12, which isn't specifically related to muscle building, but that's another one that vegans aren't going to be getting from their diet and will need
Yeah.
to supplement.
Yeah, those are the typical, like I think B12, vitamin D, creatine, zinc sometimes is actually kind of a little deficient around there as well. So those are the kind of things that you have to make sure that you kind of maintaining. But overall, I think that the key and the best strategy to really implement, like you have to have a diet that has a really good balanced amino acid profile, which means obtaining different sources of plant-based like foods that are going to contain or they're going to provide different sources of amino acids like that are coming from different protein. I know you wrote in here some examples. You want to go through some of those like food combinations, and we can talk also about food combos, because you don't always have to combine foods. There's obviously this notion that in order for you to be able to kind of get a full complete protein, you have to combine them. You can combinations is fine, but then you can also think about, you don't have to like make sure that you eat rice with beans like that. That's not necessarily a kind of like you can eat rice for lunch and you can eat beans for dinner, and you're still gonna get like the amino acid you need. So you don't have to think about this as like a combo. But obviously, what there's so much stuff we're gonna talk about in here. I think it's gonna be a really helpful way to kind of get it all together in one setting. So yeah.
Yeah, so it can be helpful to combine them together just for satiety, to have a balanced meal. It's not necessary. It's not like if you split them up, you're not going to be getting that protein, because it's more about over the course of the day whether you're getting enough.
Yep.
But some examples are, you could have a bean soup with some whole grain crackers. Beans and rice is another good one. Pasta and peas, whole wheat bread and peanut butter. Hummus is another great one because it has chickpeas and
Yep.
tahini. And tahini is made with sesame seeds,
Yep.
and that has some protein in it. Refried beans and tortillas, salad with chickpeas and sunflower seeds, and also chickpea curry is another great option.
Yep. Yeah. So all these like usually beans, like plant-based, and then we start to think obviously kind of beyond that. We can think about all kinds of soy-based products, including, for example, things like tempeh, things like what's it called, seitan, which is more of like that's not soy-based, but more like a gluten type of based protein. And then we have things like
Tofu.
tofu. Yeah, so tofu is a big one as well. So those are going to be like kind of like main important, like really good sources of protein, and sometimes actually near like complete proteins as well that can also be incorporated. And also grains, like options that, for example, like things like quinoa, like that's like a pretty good amino acid profile. And in a cup of quinoa, you're going to have closer to, I think it's like 8 to 9 grams of protein. So they're definitely going to kind of help you incorporate a few extra kind of protein sources here and there to help you kind of have a balance intake of all those different things. So it's like, trying to make a list. I think like for people that are plant-based or plant forward, like to kind of incorporate more of those things, just making sure that you make a list of all these different kinds of like protein sources, so you can kind of start building out sort of like an actual plan for you daily, um, to ensure that you kind of get in that. But like I said, I think the biggest thing, if you're trying to kind of gain muscle right now, or let's say, for example, you're an athlete, it's really focusing on making sure that your protein needs are met. And sometimes to do that, you're gonna have to get maybe supplementation. And soy-based protein powders are good. I like obviously things that are gonna be a combination of like things like pea and rice, as I mentioned earlier. Those are definitely going to be good options as well. And now there's all kinds of like different kinds of ready to drink shakes. Like Owen has a company that has like really good ones. Orgain has options as well in there. So like there's like different kinds of now ready to drink alternatives that are pretty good. They may not have as much protein as other options that are animal based, but they're still gonna have enough for that. So I think that's definitely like a big thing for takeaway for vegans, and overall for people that are not, that just trying to do gain muscle, and whether you're vegan or not. I think the key thing is just making sure that you prioritize how much protein you're getting daily, which I promise if that was the one thing that you would just focus daily to try to fix, you're finding yourself eating less, controlling your hunger levels better, and actually like in the long term too, like looking so much better as well, because of the fact that you're just kind of putting protein to work in the right places, and really improving recovery in all those different markers that we kind of talked about earlier as well. So
Yeah, and I think a good place to end off here might be to talk a little bit about your experiences. If you've worked with any vegan clients or clients that prefer to have plant-based protein sources, and also how much protein you typically recommend people have.
I've had a limited experience with a few people. Currently right now in our program, there's one person that is like fully vegan, with some struggles around weight. I definitely don't necessarily think it's because that person is vegan they're struggling with. It could be maybe a fact that, it's they're not getting enough protein because it's just simply so difficult to, again, like try to lose body fat and then at the same time trying to get over 100 grams or 150 grams of protein from plant-based sources without necessarily kind of going over a crazy amount of calories on a daily basis. So that is definitely kind of like a big kind of area and thing that is important to consider. But I've also worked with people that, for example, they were trying to gain muscle mass. So this is actually a female that wanted to do that. And she actually managed to get 140 150 grams of protein on a daily basis being fully vegan, very full, like plant-based and plant forward. And she was actually like she did wonderful. And you can kind of like see all the kind of like gains and improvements. And again, it depends also on body type. This is a person that was actually very skinny, um but she wanted to kind of like still continue to follow that lifestyle. So we kind of develop a plan around that to help them and help her be able to create awareness around that. I think at the very beginning we realized that she was getting like 60 70 grams of protein per day. So that was like super eye opening for her. It's like, oh wow. And then when she started kind of like going up slowly, which we did in a really kind of slow way as well, because it's kind of hard for you to go from like 60 grams of protein daily to 150 grams of protein daily overnight, especially as a vegan, because when you kind of put that in plates and food, like it's a lot more food. So you have to kind of like build yourself up to that. That's what I typically kind of see people struggling with. So that's essentially what we try to kind of like incorporate and include for some of them. But it's possible. It's just a matter of, and we work with a lot of people that are more like plant forward. So they still eat animal based products. They still they still eat like dairy and different things like that, eggs, but they maybe not have like actual meat sources. We makes it easier because you can still have sources from there that can incorporate some protein, like sources there, that it doesn't really make it as difficult to be able to kind of get your protein needs daily.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I think another thing to point out is about the fiber that you get on a vegan diet. If you're looking for fat loss, you might maybe your protein isn't as high as it might be on a omnivore diet, but you're probably getting a ton more fiber just because the protein sources on a vegan diet often have a lot of fiber. So, and
yeah.
fiber is very satiating, so you might be able to get some of that satiety effect from the fiber.
Yeah, and that's usually, it's like it's a double-edged sword, because of the fact that sometimes when you have like too much fiber, then you kind of feel like too full, and then you kind of struggle to get enough. Of course, that's really helpful for like fat loss, but at the same time, it's ensuring that you're kind of getting enough protein. So it's like trying to kind of find a really good middle ground to kind of help in terms of that. So, but yeah, so that's usually kind of like that's the kind of like the main kind of takeaway that we can kind of close up here with today. But yeah, as usual, guys, if you have any questions about this, let us know. Like, tag us in on Instagram, at Andres Ayesta or at Nibble to Nourish, and we can answer any of your questions that you may have in terms of that, and we can kind of like get you into just get more education. If you guys want to have more exclusive education directly from us, you can actually join our private Facebook community, which is called Planet's Nutrition Club. And it's on Facebook. It's for free. You just request to join. And if you go in the show notes right now, you can actually see the link in there to be able to request to join. And of course, if you're interested in getting coached by a nutrition professional, registered dietitian, and coaching to a program, we can tell you a little more about our nutrition makeover method and how we kind of help people completely transform and do a massive makeover of their lifestyle and nutrition in 4 months. And then make sure that you simply kind of hit that apply button in the show notes, and we can kind of help you out with that and get in touch with you to see if you would be a good fit for what we are looking for in our ideal clients to join and help them transform their lives. So, Kenzie, it was a pleasure to have you here once again. Thank you for
Yeah, it's a great episode.
this really fun conversation. We'll see you guys on the next episode of the Nutrition Blueprint podcast. Until the next one.